Jonah chapter 1, verses 13 through 14. Instead, the men did their best to row back to land, but they could not, for the sea grew even wilder than before. Then they cried out to the Lord, "Please, Lord, do not let us die for taking this man's life. Do not hold us accountable for killing an innocent man, for you, Lord, have done as you pleased." When I was in college, I did security for mosh pits. There was a venue in my hometown, and they did hardcore shows, and the mosh pits were usually fairly intense. My job was to get folks out of the mosh pit if their lip ring got knocked out or if someone kicked them in the head. You know, typical training for a youth director. And without fail, these shows would always have a portion where one, if not all, of the bands would share a testimony or a message about Jesus. They would point to a God who loved them more than they could comprehend and freed them from some sort of addiction or oppression. They would talk about a God of grace and then launch into some of the loudest music I have ever heard. Our passage today deals with faithfulness. In this passage, Jonah, a prophet of God, has spent 12 verses avoiding faithfulness as hard as he could, seeking out expensive and life-risking ways that he could ignore what God has called him to do. He's bought the ticket, got on the boat, took a nap, and now is stuck in the storm. You know, the Bible is full of surprises. In a book where the main character is swallowed by a fish, this is one of the most surprising passages. The sailors on the boat were an effective storytelling tool for the author of Jonah. They stood in for every Gentile that the hearer or reader had ever met or interacted with. Jewish tradition held that the crew was made up of one person from each of the 70 kinds of people on our planet. Scholars are uncertain as to when Jonah was written, but most posit that it was after the exile, some point around 4th century BCE. And so the people of Israel will have had experience living outside of being the chosen people. They would have known what it was like to be in a land of foreign gods, foreign customs, foreign cultures. They would have known what it was like to be exiled. And for the readers and the hearers of our story, this is where the stereotypes would start. Not unlike our own prejudice we carry around with us, the Jewish readers of this story would know how they are when they heard about the crew of the boat was made up of the nations. In our last devotion, we heard how Jonah told them to chuck him into the sea. This is when the original hearers might have said something to the effect of, I'm sure they won't even bat an eye at this. You know how they are. And yet, though we are a quarter of the way through the book, we see the first bit of true faithfulness to God, a cry for mercy and a cry of adoration. In a story where the prophet of God is overcome with prejudice, we see the faithfulness of the other, and we must learn from that. Who is your ship's crew? Where in your life is faithfulness hiding? Jonah didn't see the faithfulness of the ship's crew. He was far too focused on running away from God, and yet he was surrounded by people who were relying on God. In our lives, we are surrounded by opportunities to see God doing work in our lives, in other people's lives, if we just choose to look for it. The thing is, Jonah probably could have learned a thing or two from these people from the nations. They were faithful when he was disobedient, after all. My challenge for you today is to seek out the places you least expect to find faithfulness. Find someone you disagree with and look without judgment or expectation and see how they know God. You might be surprised to find faithfulness in unexpected places, and you probably don't actually know how they are. Amen.